If we are going to understand the reassuring quality of faithfulness, we must begin with something fundamental. The human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to uncertainty. We are biologically wired to detect instability. When the ground beneath us shifts unpredictably, emotionally, socially, relationally, our bodies register that as danger. Cortisol rises, vigilance increases. We prepare for threat. And that state, sustained over time, erodes both psychological health and moral clarity. Faithfulness, at its most basic level, counters that instability. To say that someone is faithful is to say that they are consistent across time. Their words and their actions align. Their commitments are not conditional upon mood, convenience, or opportunity. There is a pattern to their behavior, and that pattern can be trusted. That predictability does something profound to the human psyche. It allows it to rest. Consider what happens in a relationship, friendship, marriage, partnership, where faithfulness is absent. Every interaction becomes a negotiation. Every silence becomes a suspicious. Every delay invites catastrophic imagination. The mind fills gaps with worst-case scenarios. This is not because people are irrational. It is because ambiguity is metabolized as potential threat. When you cannot rely on someone's continued presence or loyalty, you are forced into hypervigilance. Or loyalty, you are forced into hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is exhausting. It fragments attention, it breeds resentment, it corrodes intimacy. Now contrast that with a relationship grounded in faithfulness. There is space, there is psychological breathing room. You are not perpetually calculating risk. You are not bracing for betrayal. Instead, you operate from an assumption of stability. That assumption becomes the foundation upon which vulnerability is possible. And vulnerability, paradoxically, is what allows genuine strength to emerge. We often mistake freedom for the absence of commitment, but psychologically speaking, the opposite is closer to the truth. The more stable and reliable the relational structure around you, the more courageously you can explore. Children demonstrate this perfectly. A child with a reliable caregiver ventures out into the world with confidence, not because the world is safe, but because retreat is secure. That reliable presence regulates fear. It provides a psychological home base. Adults are no different. When you know that someone is faithful, truly faithful, you take greater risks in growth, creativity, and responsibility. You are not squandering energy on relational defense. You are building, you are aiming upward. Faithfulness, then, is not merely a moral ornament. It is a stabilizing force in the architecture of the self. It lowers chaos. It reduces entropy in the interpersonal domain. And wherever chaos is reduced, order can emerge, but we should be careful not to reduce faithfulness to mere routine. It is not robotic repetition. It is chosen consistency. And that distinction matters. Faithfulness requires memory. It requires that you remember what you promised yesterday and allow that promise to constrain your behavior today. That act of self-binding is psychologically sophisticated. It means that your future self honors the commitments of your past self. When two people do this for one another, something extraordinary happens. Time begins to work in their favor. Every kept promise accumulates. Trust compounds, and trust, once established deeply enough, becomes a shield against inevitable misunderstandings. There will be conflict. There will be disappointment. But in a faithful relationship, those disruptions are interpreted through a broader narrative of reliability. The question is not, are you abandoning me? But rather, how do we repair this? That shift in interpretation is everything. Without faithfulness, conflict signals collapse. Without faithfulness, conflict signals collapse. With faithfulness, conflict signals friction within a durable structure. The difference determines whether relationships dissolve under pressure or strengthen because of it. There is also something deeply philosophical at play. To be faithful is to orient yourself toward permanence in a world that is constantly changing. Everything around us is in flux. Carriers shift, health fluctuates, cultural values transform. Faithfulness becomes an anchor. It asserts that at least in this domain, in this bond, there will be continuity. Continuity produces reassurance because it affirms meaning. If nothing persists, nothing ultimately matters. But when a person stands by their word across time, they declare that some things are worth preserving. Loyalty says this relationship is not disposable. And that declaration pushes back against the disposable ethos that so often dominates modern life. Psychologically, we crave that resistance to disposability. We want to know that we are not interchangeable. We want to know that our presence is not provisional. Faithfulness answers that need not with sentiment, but with sustained action. And that is why faithfulness creates emotional security. It tells the nervous system, you are not alone in chaos. It tells the mind, you do not have to scan constantly for danger. It tells the heart, you are chosen, not temporarily tolerated. This security does not make life painless. It makes it bearable. And more than bearable, it makes it purposeful. Because when you are secure, you can commit yourself to something beyond survival. So if you want to bring reassurance into a world saturated with anxiety, begin there. Become someone whose word stabilizes the emotional environment. Become someone whose consistency lowers the collective pulse of fear in your family, your friendships, your community. In a culture obsessed with novelty and escape routes, choose to stay. Choose to keep your promises. Choose to make your presence dependable. Because when you are faithful, you do more than maintain a relationship. You create a refuge. And in a chaotic world, refuge is no small gift. If faithfulness creates emotional security between people, it also does something equally important. Within the individual, it forges character. And that is not a trivial claim. Character is not a decorative trait. It is the structure that determines how you will act when pressure is applied. It is who you become. Faithfulness resists that fragmentation. It says, I will not be ruled by impulse. I will be guided by commitment. That is a profound act of self-organization. When you decide to remain faithful to a partner, to a friend, to a vocation, to a moral code, you are voluntarily constraining your future behavior. You are binding your tomorrow to the promise you made yesterday. That self-binding creates coherence, and coherence is the foundation of character. Think about it this way. Every time you keep a promise when breaking it would be easier, you strengthen the internal connection between your word and your action. You teach yourself that what you say matters. Over time, that becomes identity. You no longer ask, what do I feel like doing? You ask, what did I commit to? And in that shift, something stabilizes within you. There is also a deeper philosophical dimension here. To be faithful is to orient yourself towards something higher than immediate gratification. It requires you to believe that long-term integrity outweighs short-term pleasure. That belief structures your perception of reality. You begin to see temptation not merely as opportunity, but as a test of alignment. And alignment is crucial. When your actions consistently contradict your stated values, you experience internal conflict. That conflict produces guilt, anxiety, and self-doubt. You may try to rationalize it, you may blame others, but at some level you know. You know when you have betrayed your own standards. Faithfulness eliminates that inner fracture. It integrates the self. Your public identity and your private behavior begin to match. That congruence generates a quiet confidence, not arrogance, not pride, but steadiness. You trust yourself because you have evidence that you can be trusted. That self-trust is invaluable. Without it, you hesitate at every crossroads. With it, you move forward decisively because you know you will act in accordance with your principles. Now, let's be clear. Faithfulness is not rigidity. It is not blind stubbornness. It is not the refusal to adapt when wisdom demands change. Rather, it is the disciplined maintenance of core commitments while allowing peripheral details to evolve. It requires discernment. It requires reflection. It requires humility. In fact, humility is an essential component of faithful character. To remain faithful over time, you must acknowledge your capacity for failure. You must recognize your susceptibility to temptation. That awareness keeps you vigilant. It prevents complacency. It reminds you that integrity is not a one-time achievement, but a daily practice. And here is where faithfulness becomes deeply reassuring, not only to others, but to yourself. When you act faithfully, you reduce the chaos within your own psyche. You are not constantly renegotiating your identity. You are not reinventing your moral framework to accommodate convenience. You stand on something solid. In a world that celebrates reinvention and fluidity, its solidity can appear unfashionable, but psychologically, it is stabilizing. It allows you to endure hardship without disintegrating. When external circumstances shift, and you are not swept away because your internal commitments remain intact. There is something almost architectural about this process. Each faithful act lays a brick, one kept promise, one resisted impulse, one honest admission. Over years, those bricks form a structure. That structure is your character, and once it is strong enough, it can bear weight. The weight of responsibility, the weight of leadership, the weight of suffering. Without faithfulness, character remains shallow. Under stress, it cracks. With faithfulness, it deepens. It becomes resilient. And resilience, perhaps more than talent or intelligence, determines long-term impact. So when we speak about the reassuring quality of faithfulness, we are not merely describing how it comforts others. We are describing how it fortifies the self. It transforms scattered impulses into disciplined intention. It turns fleeting emotion into durable identity. It replaces internal chaos with moral clarity. And that clarity is liberating. Because when you know who you are, because you have proven it through consistent action, you are free from the tyranny of every passing desire. So the question becomes intensely personal. What promises have you made? And are you living as though they matter? Because every time you choose faithfulness over convenience, you are not just preserving a relationship, you are constructing your character. And in the end, you do not rise to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your integrity deliberately, brick by brick, promise by promise, and become someone whose character is strong enough to carry both your ambitions and your burdens. When faithfulness operates at the level of the individual, it stabilizes character. When it operates between two people, it creates emotional security. But when it becomes embedded in a group, when it is practiced collectively, it does something even more profound. It builds civilization. That may sound exaggerated, but it isn't. Every functioning community, from a family to a nation, depends on an invisible network of kept promises, contracts honored, vows maintained, responsibilities fulfilled without constant supervision. If those commitments dissolve, the structure collapses, not all at once, but gradually through erosion. Trust is the currency of community life, and faithfulness is what gives that currency value. Imagine a workplace where no one reliably follows through. Deadlines become suggestions. Agreements become optional. Accountability evaporates very quickly. Productivity plummets, not because people lack intelligence, but because coordination becomes impossible. Everyone must double-check everyone else. Energy that could be directed toward creation is instead diverted toward monitoring. The same principle applies in families. If parents are inconsistent, if commitments are frequently broken, children do not simply feel disappointed. They internalize instability as normal. They learn that words do not necessarily correspond to reality. That lesson carries forward into friendships, into careers, into marriages. Faithlessness replicates itself socially. But the opposite is also true. When a community is marked by faithfulness, by reliability, loyalty, and consistency, it generates a sense of shared key. Rather, people know what to expect. Expectations reduce friction increases cooperation, and cooperation allows complexity to flourish. Psychologically, human beings are cooperative creatures. We evolved in groups. Our survival depended on coordinated action. But cooperation is fragile. It requires reciprocal trust. If I am to invest my effort into a shared project, I must believe that you will do the same. If I suspect that you will defect when it becomes inconvenient, I will withdraw my investment preemptively. Faithfulness prevents that collapse into suspicion. It signals repeatedly and demonstrably that participation is not conditional upon ease. There is also something morally elevating about collective faithfulness. When individuals keep their commitments to the group, they reinforce a shared narrative. We are people who stand by one another. That narrative becomes identity. It shapes behavior, it sets a standard, and standards matter. Without them, communities drift toward mediocrity. With them, people are called upward. With them, people are called upward. Consider how cultures deteriorate. It rarely begins with dramatic betrayal. It begins with small compromises, minor dishonesty, casual disloyalty, promises postponed. Over time, these micro-fractures accumulate. Cynicism spreads. Fuck. People begin to assume self-interest as the primary motive in others. Once that assumption hardens, communal bonds weaken rapidly. Cynicism is socially corrosive. It tells individuals that loyalty is naive, that commitment is foolish, that everyone is ultimately acting in self-preservation. And if enough people believe that, they will behave accordingly. Faithlessness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Faithfulness interrupts that spiral. When someone chooses loyalty in a context where betrayal would be advantageous, it challenges the prevailing narrative. It demonstrates that integrity is not extinct. It raises the moral bar for everyone observing. Others are reminded, sometimes uncomfortably, that a higher standard is possible. This is why even a single faithful individual can influence an entire group dynamic. Reliability is contagious, just as unreliability is. When you consistently show up, follow through, and honor your word, you subtly pressure others to do the same. Not through coercion, but through example. An example is powerful. There is also a structural dimension to this. Communities that cultivate faithfulness create resilience. When hardship arrives, and it always does, those bonds are tested. Economic downturns, internal conflict, external threat, these forces expose weaknesses. In a community built on fragile commitments, stress fractures quickly widen. People retreat into self-protection. But in a community shaped by faithfulness, stress activates solidarity. Members lean in rather than pulling away. They absorb strain collectively. That shared endurance deepens cohesion rather than dissolving it. At a philosophical level, faithfulness within community affirms that human beings are not merely isolated agents pursuing private gain. It asserts that shared destiny matters. It affirms that belonging carries obligations. Modern culture often emphasizes autonomy to the point of alienation. We are told to prioritize personal fulfillment above all else, but without reciprocal commitment, autonomy becomes isolation, and isolation breeds anxiety, resentment, and fragmentation. Faithfulness reintroduces responsibility into belonging. It reminds us that community is not a consumer product, it is a moral achievement. It must be sustained intentionally. It must be protected from neglect, and that protection begins with individuals. Institutions do not become faithful on their own. They reflect the character of the people within them. If you want a trustworthy workplace, be trustworthy. If you want a stable family, be consistent. If you want a resilient society, practice loyalty in your own sphere of influence. Because here is the truth. You are always contributing to the moral climate around you. Through your reliability or your inconsistency. Through your commitment or your withdrawal. Neutrality is an illusion. The reassuring quality of faithfulness, then, extends far beyond private relationships. It stabilizes networks. It sustains cooperation. It protects against the corrosive effects of cynicism. It transforms groups of individuals into communities capable of enduring complexity and adversity. So ask yourself, what kind of social fabric are you helping to weave? One strengthened by kept promises or one weakened by quiet compromise? Because communities do not collapse overnight. They unravel thread by thread. Be the person who reinforces the thread. If faithfulness builds security in ordinary moments and strengthens the fabric of community, its true depth is revealed under strain. It is easy to speak of loyalty when circumstances are favorable. It is far more difficult to embody it when life becomes unpredictable, painful, or unfair. And yet it is precisely in those moments that faithfulness becomes most reassuring. Hardship has a clarifying effect. It strips away pretense. It exposes the strength or fragility of the commitments we claim to hold. When illness enters a family, when financial pressure tightens, when reputation falters, when failure humiliates us publicly, the question is no longer abstract. It becomes intensely practical. Who remains? There is something almost existential about that question, because suffering by its nature isolates. Pain narrows perception. It can make the world feel hostile and indifferent, and when that isolation is compounded by abandonment, despair deepens. Quickly, the psychological weight becomes heavier than the original problem. But when faithfulness endures through difficulty, it interrupts the descent. To understand why, we need to recognize that we need to recognize that human beings do not merely suffer events, we interpret them. And interpretation determines resilience. If hardship is interpreted as evidence that one is alone, unwanted, or disposable, it becomes corrosive. If it is interpreted as a shared burden, it becomes bearable. Faithfulness transforms the meaning of suffering from solitary punishment into collective challenge. Consider what happens in a marriage when crisis strikes: a diagnosis, a loss, a season of emotional instability. If one partner withdraws emotionally or physically, the suffering multiplies. The injured party must now process not only the crisis itself, but the rupture of trust. The ground disappears beneath their feet. But if the partner remains steady, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps anxiously, but present, the experience shifts. The message conveyed is simple yet profound. We face this together. That statement does not eliminate pain. It recontextualizes it. It reduces existential threat. Psychologically, this matters because stability during chaos regulates fear. The nervous system takes cues from the environment. A calm, consistent presence communicates safety even when circumstances are volatile. It tells the body you are not navigating this alone. That co-regulation is one of the most powerful forms of reassurance available to us as social beings. There is also a moral courage embedded in enduring faithfulness. To remain when it would be easier to escape requires fortitude. It demands that you subordinate immediate comfort to long-term commitment. And that is no small task in a culture that offers constant alternatives, constant exits, constant reinvention. Staying during hardship is rarely glam. It is often quiet. It involves small, repetitive acts of reliability, showing up to difficult conversations, maintaining routines when motivation is low, resisting the urge to withdraw when frustration peaks. These actions do not generate applause. They generate stability, and stability during crisis is priceless. We must also confront an uncomfortable truth. Adversity tests not only relationships, but identity. When you are under pressure, you discover who you are. The temptation to abandon commitments in pursuit of relief becomes intense. You begin to rationalize. I deserve better. This is too hard. This isn't what I signed up for. In some cases, boundaries must be set. Not all circumstances justify endurance. But often the impulse to flee is less about justice and more about discomfort. Faithfulness requires discernment, the wisdom to distinguish between harmful entrapment and meaningful perseverance. When you choose perseverance appropriately, you build something within yourself that cannot be purchased. Resilience grounded in integrity. That resilience has ripple effects. Others observe it. They internalize the lesson that commitment is not fragile. That loyalty is not conditional upon convenience. That promises are not revoked at the first sign of strain. This modeling strengthens collective endurance. Communities marked by this kind of faithfulness respond to crisis differently. Instead of fragmentation, there is coordination. Instead of blame, there is problem solving. Instead of panic, there is measured action. The presence of even a few steady individuals can anchor an entire group in turbulent times. Philosophically, enduring faithfulness asserts that meaning transcends circumstance. It declares that value is not determined solely by ease or pleasure. It affirms that some bonds are worth sustaining even when sustaining them is costly. T affirmation is deeply reassuring because it suggests that life is not governed purely by volatility. There are constants. There are commitments that outlast seasons of instability. There are relationships that do not evaporate under pressure. In a world saturated with uncertainty, economic shifts, social upheaval, personal transitions, the knowledge that someone will remain steady becomes a psychological refuge. It does not solve every problem, but it creates a foundation from which problems can be addressed. And here is the paradox. Faithfulness during hardship often strengthens bonds more than comfort ever could. When two people endure something difficult together, their shared memory becomes evidence of durability. They can look back and say, "We survived that." That memory becomes a stabilizing reference point for future challenges. So when difficulty inevitably arrives in your life, and it will, the question is not simply how you will cope. It is how you will show up. Will you withdraw into self-protection? Or will you lean into commitment, because in moments of strain, your faithfulness may be the very thing that prevents someone else from collapsing. Hardship reveals what is real. Let it reveal your steadiness. Be the presence that does not disappear when things become complicated. Be the voice that does not retreat when emotions intensify. Be the commitment that does not dissolve when tested, because when chaos rises, faithfulness is not merely admirable. It is transformative. If faithfulness stabilizes relationships, strengthens character, and fortifies communities, especially under pressure, then we arrive at something even deeper. Faithfulness is the tangible expression of love. We speak about love constantly in our culture. We write songs about it, we build entire identities around the pursuit of it, but we often confuse love with intensity, with chemistry, with the surge of emotion that overtakes us in moments of connection. And while emotion is powerful, it is also unstable. It fluctuates with mood, circumstance, and biology. Faithfulness is what transforms love from a feeling into a structure. Feelings are involuntary. Commitment is chosen. And that distinction matters immensely. Because if love is defined solely by what we feel in a given moment, then it becomes fragile. It rises and falls like weather. But if love is defined, at least in part, by faithfulness, by the repeated decision to act in alignment with care and responsibility, then it acquires depth. Think about what we truly mean when we say we want to be loved. We do not merely mean that we want someone to feel affection toward us in isolated moments. Yes, we mean that we want to be held in consideration over time. We want to know that our well-being matters in someone else's decision-making process. We want to know that our vulnerabilities will not be weaponized when emotions shift. That kind of assurance cannot be delivered through sentiment alone. It requires sustained action. Faithfulness says, "I will treat you tomorrow with the same dignity I affirm today." It says, "My care for you will not evaporate when I am irritated, bored, or tempted." It says, "I recognize the weight of what we have built, and I will not casually dismantle it." Psychologically, this consistency regulates fear. To love someone deeply is to expose yourself. You reveal insecurities, flaws, histories. Without faithfulness, that exposure is dangerous. With faithfulness, it becomes transformative. It allows intimacy to deepen without the constant threat of abandonment. There is also something sacrificial about faithful love, and sacrifice is often misunderstood. It does not mean self-erasure or martyrdom. It means that you willingly subordinate immediate impulses for the sake of a higher value. In love, that higher value is the preservation and flourishing of the relationship. When you choose faithfulness in moments of temptation or frustration, you are saying that the long-term good of the bond outweighs the short-term relief of indulgence. That choice reinforces trust. It accumulates meaning. And meaning is what sustains relationships across decades. We must also confront a difficult truth. Emotions alone are insufficient to carry a relationship through the inevitable phases of monotony, stress, and disillusionment. There will be days when affection feels muted, days when misunderstanding creates distance. If love depends exclusively on emotional intensity, it will falter in those seasons. Faithfulness bridges the gap. It maintains presence when excitement fades. It maintains respect when disagreements arise. It maintains patience when growth is uneven. In doing so, it creates the conditions under which affection can reemerge stronger and more mature. There is a developmental aspect here. Early love is often passionate and idealized. Mature love is tested and deliberate. It has survived disappointment. It has absorbed imperfection. And because of that, it is more grounded. Faithfulness is the mechanism of that maturation. It also protects against the corrosive influence of resentment. When partners consistently act in dubba, eyes that align with their commitments, small irritations are interpreted within a larger narrative of goodwill. But when faithfulness erodes, even minor conflicts are magnified, doubt seeps in, motives are questioned. Trust, once compromised, is painfully difficult to rebuild. This is why faithfulness is not restrictive, it is liberating. It frees both individuals from the constant need to evaluate whether the other is still invested. It reduces relational anxiety. It allows attention to shift from self-protection to shared growth. Philosophically, faithful love affirms that human beings are not disposable commodities. In a culture that often treats relationships as interchangeable, easily entered, easily exited, faithfulness asserts permanence. It declares that bonds are not to be discarded at the first sign of inconvenience. That declaration is deeply countercultural, but it is also deeply reassuring. Because to be loved faithfully is to know that your value is not contingent on perfection. It is to know that your flaws will be met with patience rather than immediate rejection. It is to know that someone has integrated you into their long-term vision of life. And that knowledge stabilizes the self. We become braver when we are loved faithfully. We risk more. We attempt more. We endure more. Because we know that failure will not automatically result in abandonment. So when we speak of faithfulness as the reassuring quality of love, we are not romanticizing constraint. We are recognizing that commitment is what gives love its durability. It transforms affection into allegiance. It transforms attraction into alliance. The question then is not simply whether you feel love. The question is whether you enact it consistently, whether your behavior communicates reliability, whether your promises are reinforced through action. Because love that is not practiced, fate, fully remains fragile. If you want your love to endure, if you want it to become something that steadies rather than destabilizes, then let it be anchored in faithfulness. Do not measure your love solely by what you feel in moments of intensity. Measure it by what you choose in moments of difficulty. Because in the end, love is not proven by passion at its peak. It is proven by loyalty over time. If faithfulness creates security in relationships, fortifies character, strengthens communities, endures through hardship, and gives love its structure, then we arrive at its most interior consequence. Faithfulness brings inner peace, and that might be its most underrated quality. We live in an age saturated with stimulation, distraction, and moral ambiguity. People speak constantly about anxiety, about restlessness, about the inability to quiet the mind. We search for techniques, meditation apps, productivity systems, self-optimization strategies, and yet beneath much of that noise lies a simpler question. Are you at peace with yourself? Of conflict, it is not the absence of conflict. It is not a life without difficulty. It is the absence of internal contradiction. It is what emerges when your actions align with your conscience. Faithfulness plays a decisive role here. When you are unfaithful to your commitments, to your word, to your responsibilities, you fracture yourself. You divide into the person who promised and the person who betrayed. That division creates tension. You may suppress it. You may rationalize it, but it lingers. Human beings possess an internal moral compass. Call it conscience. Call it integrated value systems. Whatever language you prefer, it functions as an internal evaluator. When you act against your own stated standards, that evaluator does not remain silent. It generates guilt, shame, and unease. Now, those emotions are not enemies. They are signals. They indicate misalignment. If misalignment persists, if faithlessness becomes habitual, those signals intensify, or alternatively, they dull, and when they dull, something even more dangerous happens. You stop trusting yourself. You no longer believe your own declarations. You make promises lightly because you have evidence that you will not keep them. That self-distrust erodes confidence. It breeds anxiety. Because if you cannot rely on yourself, what can you rely on? Faithfulness restores that internal trust. Every time you honor a commitment despite inconvenience, you strengthen the bond between intention and action. You teach yourself that your word carries weight. Over time, that produces a quiet steadiness. You move through the world without the constant background noise of self-reproach. This does not mean you become perfect. It means that when you fail, and you will, you acknowledge it honestly and correct course. Faithfulness includes the courage to admit error and repair damage. Avoidance perpetuates chaos. Ownership restores order. There is something deeply stabilizing about knowing that you are striving to live in accordance with your principles. It simplifies decision-making. When temptation arises, the question is not endlessly negotiable. You have already chosen your standard. That clarity reduces internal debate. An internal debate, when chronic, is exhausting. Consider the mental energy consumed by concealment. When someone is living unfaithfully, whether in relationships, in work, or in private conduct, they must manage appearances. They must remember which version of the story they told to whom. They must anticipate exposure. That vigilance creates chronic stress. Faithfulness eliminates the need for concealment. What you present publicly matches what you practice privately. There is no elaborate performance to maintain that congruence. It frees cognitive and emotional resources. Philosophically, this congruence is integrity in its truest sense. Integrity means wholeness. A structure with integrity is not fractured. A person with integrity is not internally divided. Faithfulness is one of the primary mechanisms through which that wholeness is achieved. And wholeness feels like peace, not excitement, not euphoria, peace. There is also a temporal dimension to this. Faithfulness aligns your past, present, and future. The commitments you made yesterday are honored today, shaping the trajectory of tomorrow. Your life becomes narratively coherent. It tells a story that makes sense. When people feel lost, it is often because their narrative is fragmented. They cannot connect who they were with who they are becoming. Faithlessness accelerates that fragmentation. Faithfulness repairs it. You begin to see your life not as a series of disconnected impulses, but as a deliberate unfolding. That sense of direction reduces existential anxiety. You know what you stand for. You know what you are building. Now, inner peace does not imply comfort at all times. Sometimes faithfulness requires difficult conversations, hard boundaries, uncomfortable sacrifices. But even in discomfort, there is steadiness. You may feel sorrow, but not self-contempt. You may feel fatigue, but not duplicity. That distinction matters at the end of the day. Literally, at the end of the day, when external noise quiets, you are left alone with your thoughts. In that solitude, status means little. Applause fades. Comparison dissolves. What remains is a simple question. Did you live in alignment with what you claim to value? If the answer is yes, even imperfectly yes, there is rest. Have been imperfectly yes, there is rest. If the answer is persistently no, rest becomes elusive. So when we speak of the reassuring quality of faithfulness, we are not only describing its social benefits, we are describing its psychological and spiritual consequence. It anchors you internally. It reduces fragmentation. It integrates desire with duty. In a world that pulls you in competing directions, faithfulness gathers you. It calls you back to your word, back to your commitments, back to the person you have chosen to become. And perhaps that is the final reassurance. You are not at the mercy of every impulse or external pressure. You can choose alignment. You can choose consistency. You can choose to live in a way that allows you to respect the person staring back at you in the mirror. Because ultimately, peace is not found in avoiding responsibility.